Hello, and welcome to episode 99 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Killorn in Napa Valley.
Oh man, how you doing?
I'm doing great, but I'm more interested in how you're doing now that you're back from your Eurotrip vacation.
I'll be honest, I'm feeling a little rusty. It's been a minute.
It's been a few weeks, man.
Yeah. I'm sure it'll come back. It's like riding a bike.
Yes, it is. And for episode 99, I think you got enough experience under your belt to get right back.
I sure hope so. If 99 in, I can't pick it up. We got bigger problems.
Very nice. So let's, ask the first most important question. What are you drinking tonight?
What am I drinking? What I'm still drinking, in fact, when I was in Morocco a couple weeks back, they gave me this incredible mint tea concoction that I have found goes great with whiskey. So that's what I'm drinking. Some sort of Moroccan spice and then good old Jack Daniels.
Moroccan spice.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I've ruined it with American whiskey.
Nah, that's just, the blending. I like the blending of things.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And my throat's been bothering me ever since. So let's hope this does some work. What are you up to?
I'm actually drinking some whiskey as well. This is a more holiday drink. This is what they would call a Jack Fire holiday drink. And it's Jack Daniels, but it's that Tennessee fire version of it.
Okay.
It's a little bit spicier.
Is it
I
cinnamon?
don't know if it's kind of like Fireball a little bit.
Yeah.
Probably could have just used Fireball, but I'm always interested in trying something new. And then it's got Coca-Cola and then some ginger in it. It's all right.
I like it. It's festive.
Look, dude, it's
spicy.
It's a Jack and Coke with some flavor components to it.
Good.
I don't think it's all that groundbreaking.
Yeah, neither one of us are setting records today, but that's okay. Sometimes you stick with what you know. Speaking of what you know, you picked a great song, and I'm going to let you elaborate.
Well, the topic of tonight is the return of the GRE, which was kind of getting left for dead here in law school admissions, and there has been a sea change caused by the ABA that we're going to talk about tonight that is really going to impact a lot of people, especially in future cycles. And so since we have this new thing happening, this kind of resurgence, we have chosen a band from the 80s and the 90s from Australia. It's the classic new wave band INXS, and the song is New Sensation, which if you've never heard it, go listen to it, because INXS has got about 5 or 6 songs that are top flight. Devil Inside being one of my favorite. And I almost thought about that for this episode, because the GRE might turn out to be the devil inside for the LSAT.
Yeah, something we'll get into, and I like that song too. Anything Michael Hutchence typically gets my blessing.
Yes, and,
right.
Rip Mr. Hutchence. We'll not talk about the nature of his demise.
Pour one out for Mike.
Look it up on Wikipedia if you're interested in the story.
Or just listen to the music.
All that aside, let's get into the LSAT world and see what's going on. Let's first talk about some of the numbers that we have. Last time out, we talked a little bit about the applicant numbers and the LSAT score trends. And in the interim, we've had the November LSAT score release. And in a nutshell, I'll say it really remained very much the same. I don't think there's any reason to break it down in tremendous detail. But the two items of note are that at this point here in kind of mid-December, we are down 5% in terms of our applicants as compared to last year, which is a good thing. If you're applying this cycle, this is what you want to see. You want to be competing against fewer people for the same number of spots. And so that's what you have here. That is coming off a very large surge in applications from a year ago. So it is still above where it was 2 years ago. But this is kind of consistent with what we thought was going to happen, which is you still have a rise overall compared to the baseline, but it's less than it was last year, which was a horrendously evil cycle that challenged everybody. And the same thing's happening with LSAT scores. Every score band from 155 to 180 in 5-point increments is now down at some relative point in terms of the high scores and the number of scores in there. And that's most pronounced in the upper levels. At 175 to 180, last time we talked, that was down 19.3%. Now it's down 20.2%. And again, I'll remind you that if 2 years ago we had 100 people in this range, last year we would have had 200 people. So we had a doubling last year. That's how big that bubble was last year. Being down 20% is fantastic. That means we're down to around 160 or so on those numbers. So you can see that it is still a bubble. It is still inflated, but it is not nearly as bad as it was last year. And so you see that across the board. 170 to 174 is down 11%. That's approaching twice what it was last time we talked. 165 to 169 is down 9.3%. That's also double what it was last time we talked. So we're really seeing now kind of like that knock-on effect where there's just not as many people with high scores as there were last year. And guess what? That's also a positive.
Yeah, that's good news.
And it's also a function of the fact that there's 5% fewer applicants. So those things work hand in hand. It's not like those are two separate points.
Yeah, I made the comment last time that it's all about your frame of reference. If you want to compare this to last year, this is great news. If you want to compare it to 2 years ago, we're still inflated. So it just depends on what you want to use as your A/B.
Yeah, I'll just take some good news and say that it's good news.
Yeah, and I'll obviously darken the clouds. Sorry.
You're glass half empty. I'm glass half full here.
You know me.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I would say if you're comparing this to last year, these are all positives.
They are. And of course, we're in the middle of December, but we're about to start a run of 4 consecutive months with LSATs. It's going to be a bit of a challenge for you and I, but you want to give us a rundown of the next, let's say the next 3
Let's do
tests
the next
or so?
3. Yeah. So the next LSAT that we have on the horizon is still about a month out, but it starts on January 14th, and it'll run the 14th, 15th, and I believe 16th of January. And the scores get released early February 2nd, which I think is a Wednesday. There is a test the next month. They haven't announced the days yet, to my knowledge, but I believe that one starts on February 12th, and I'll run over the course of that week. And then the hits keep coming. We've got another one in March, which begins the week of March 12th. And you have until February 3rd to register for March. The good news there is a little bit like this last registration cycle, where we got November scores in time to register for January. You will get January scores in time to register for March, which is good.
Yeah, and those 3 tests are all in the middle of the month.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about when they're rolling out, just think the middle. And they haven't really released the specific dates on February and March the last time I checked, but they're always going to be Saturday and Sunday at least. And then with rare exception, they add Tuesday in there. Yeah. And I can't see more than 3 days for any of these administrations.
Yeah, typically a Tuesday, maybe a Thursday for accommodations, and then a makeup the following Thursday. It's standard.
Yeah, now if you are taking one of those LSATs, one of the things that we like to do whenever we have new information, and we got a lot of new information from the November test, is we like to do a crystal ball webinar. Sit down and kind of talk about what's on a typical LSAT, the kind of things that you should actually study in preparation for any given test. And then oftentimes, John, we make a prediction about what might be on one or more of those LSATs. And usually when we make a prediction, we're pretty good. We made the prediction for October that happened to be correct. We said that they would use January 2019, an unreleased LSAT, and they would give it to the test takers in November, and that's exactly what they did.
Yeah, we even called the makeup test for November, which I was very content to just hang up my hat, but you insist that we do more. So we'll be back.
You made that prediction, so I'll give you full credit on the makeup prediction there.
You keep me on the hot seat.
Yeah, we did the podcast the night before, and the podcast came out during the middle of that test day, and we're like, "Yep, got it right." Which, again, I will say this every single time this topic comes up: we treat it in a very cavalier fashion. We just kind of we toss it off, like, "Yeah, we do this all the time," because we have done it a few times now. No one else has ever done it. I'm not sure anyone else ever will do it. It requires a lot of information and a huge amount of kind of tracking. And if you haven't been tracking what LSAC does for the past 5, 10, 15 years, you probably don't have enough information to be able to make that prediction. And so I just remind people once again, this is what we do here. We try to give our students, our listeners, inside information about this test, the kind of information you can't get anywhere else. And I don't mind patting my back and then also yours as well with that kind of commentary, because I think it actually... When I'm all finished with the LSAT, let me just put it this way. This will be one of the things I'm most proud of that we were able to do, because we shouldn't be able to do it. It is it's like standing on the top of Everest. It's not something a lot of people are going to be able to do.
I think that's very fair. So if you want to come hear us take another swing at it, we will be having a crystal ball on the evening of January 4th. I think it's at 8 p.m. Eastern. It's free. If you show up and attend live, you'll get to hear it. If you're a PowerScore student, you'll get a recording of it.
Yeah, and if you're a PowerScore student, we'll post the problem sets that we think will mirror what the content of the test is. And on many direct message reports that I got from the last LSAT, they can be quite helpful.
Yeah,
so,
that was actually one of the most gratifying things that I think, for me, that I think we did. It's great to predict the test. It's even better to hear from students and be like, God, I'm so glad I did that game you said to do. That's deeply rewarding.
And we have a few very specific ideas as to the content that is going to be of the nature that will appear in January. It's not the exact questions, of course, because those have not been released, but of the nature that we think you should be studying and that you should be ready for. And again, that's part of that insider approach that we use, and that's one of the benefits of being a PowerScore student, whether you're in a course or in analytics or what have you. That's what we're trying to do for everybody, is give you a higher score.
Absolutely. So that's a look ahead. You want to take a moment to reflect?
No, that transition was so smooth.
Oh, thanks.
I'm going to let you continue on.
Oh, boy. One of the things, and I think a lot of people were playing this kind of like year in review game with Spotify in particular, but we were able to pull some podcast numbers from this year. And this is less about gratifying ourselves, and I think more just speaks to the nature of, it's a community. We're able to help. And I think that's cool. Let's run through some of the Spotify numbers that were given to us for the podcast itself in this past year. And again, not to self-congratulate too much, but maybe just a little.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool because it always comes out in early December, and then I see a bunch of things on Twitter where people are like, look what podcast I listen to the most.
Right.
And then PowerScore's up there, and I'm like, yes.
It's funny. You might be different than me. Anytime someone says that they listen to me more than any other thing, I always want to apologize. But
yeah, glass half empty for you. I'm glass half full. I'm like,
you're welcome.
Yeah, I'm like, wow. It's cool.
But we did have quite a number of people. In fact, the final number of people that listened to us, apparently more than any other podcast, was 1,348 people. It's pretty cool.
That's not bad because that's not the number of listeners that we had. There were thousands of them. But the fact that we were number one for over 1,300, basically 1,350 people, that blew my mind. Because I don't listen to a whole lot of podcasts. And then to know that people who do were into it, I was like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts either. Certainly don't listen to us. But it's, again, gratifying that people do.
Actually, John, technically you do listen to us every episode we record.
I'm doing it right now.
Sorry.
Another cool stat, and this might actually be even more impressive, at least for me, more gratifying, was the 278 people listened to all of our episodes, listened to every single episode we put out in the past year.
In full. Not even partial. They listened to it in full. And again, this is just Spotify, and I'll make mention that Spotify is not our biggest channel, but they actually put out a lot of really cool data in the little wrapper of the year. So this isn't the full numbers of listenership. It just means that if you're a Spotify listener, there were 278 people who said, I'm listening to every single minute, even the endings. I'm like, wow, you're dedicated.
Yeah.
So hats off to those of you who fall into that group. I'm super impressed.
I'm super apologetic.
See, I wish there was a way to identify those people. I'd be like, let's have a huge party like in New York or LA.
I'd absolutely round them up.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
You have to have your card. It's like a vaccine card. You got to show up and show I did listen to all the episodes.
Yeah, your podcast proof. We were actually, again, just in terms of Spotify, I think we doubled our listeners year over year, roughly.
Yeah, we saw that across all channels. And not every channel releases the information in a similar fashion or at a similar time, but that was something that's also really gratifying, is that we're starting to get a lot more listeners overall, doubled it last year. And the year before was not a small year for us in terms of podcast listeners. So it was a big surprise to me to see it double like that.
And it wasn't just by volume. I think the other thing that I was I'm surprised to see, but certainly gracious about, was the widespread nature of who tunes in. So we doubled our listeners, but we also had listeners in 48 different countries, which is incredible.
You know, My wife is a big pit bull fan. You know what she would say?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
She
Because I
loves
like your
pit
wife,
bull.
but now I'm second guessing.
She's a dancer. She likes to dance. Pitbull makes her dance. So she would be like, Mr. Worldwide.
Mr. Worldwide. She and I are going to have a word at Christmas.
That's okay. I'm not a huge Pitbull fan myself, but there's some songs where I understand.
Yeah.
It's,
The
super catchy.
48 countries of listeners is just on Spotify. It's pretty remarkable.
I feel like a few of those countries might be accidental clicks.
That's my boy. And you're starting to sound like me.
Yeah, somebody in Estonia is like, what is... Oh, that's not what I thought it was.
Right.
Well...
Talking about the podcast, though, I do want to put a second almost disclaimer on it. I know you probably want to make this point as well, is that as gratifying as it is to have that many people listening and to have this kind of like outreach, I think it's important to recognize what it is and what it isn't. And one of the things that I never want people to confuse this with or conflate is that, again, I think as insightful and informative as it is, it's not a course. This is not a product that can replace the typical things that we sell.
It's designed to actually show how we teach the LSAT. And you and I were talking about this before because we got a wave of comments after the last LSAT and even these Spotify rapper posts that came up where people were like, I used it as a course and it was great. And I have to admit, I had really mixed feelings. I was like, well, I'm glad you're listening because we obviously go into LSAT questions and techniques and methods quite a bit. But at the same time, it made me kind of like skip a beat as far as my heart because I was like, that means you're missing so much because this is just a window into what we do. And it's just a beam of light. It is not at all the entire light source or the entire room that's there. There's only a fraction of what you need to know for the LSAT that's covered in this podcast. To me, the most useful aspect of the podcast is to keep people current on what's going on, reminders and changes that are occurring in the LSAT, and then any color that we can give on like, let's solve a parallel reasoning question. That's really to say, these are the kind of things that we like to do. This is the kind of stuff we talk about in our courses, in tutoring, what have you. It's designed to show you how we teach, not everything we teach. So I guess the takeaway I would say is if you like what you hear here and you like the style that we have, then you will love our courses because this is how we do it in class, except we cover way more topics and we can actually look at LSAT questions and break them down visually, which I think is absolutely essential to really learning and understanding this test going forward.
Well said. It's a little bit like thinking you're a poli-sci major because you watch the news. It's not quite enough. We cover a lot, but anytime I hear somebody say, like, how'd you study? I listened to Dave and John. I'm like, that's not how you study, though.
No, that's how you get entertained, hopefully. Sometimes.
Possibly drunk.
Well, either way, it's just something to think about. So I always feel like if that's one of your primary avenues, there's so much more that we do than just this podcast, even though we love doing it. I think you and I spend probably an inordinate amount of time working on this podcast, preparing information for it, especially around each test. So we know that there's a lot of value in it, but we've spent thousands of hours more putting these courses together and creating the techniques and methods that we use and explaining them and helping our instructors explain them better. That's where the real meat of what we do is. That's the heart of this company.
Yeah. If this is helpful, you wouldn't believe the things we sell.
Yeah, so on that note, let's not talk about the LSAT. Let's talk about the GRE.
Hard pivot. I like it.
And if you're an LSAT taker, and I would presume most of you are, this is still really useful for you because the GRE is about to make a big debut on the law school admissions stage. And several years ago, it made kind of a minor debut. In the sense that the University of Arizona decided that they wanted to use the GRE as an admissions test and to be able to consider GRE students. And their stated intent was they wanted to widen the applicant pool and they wanted to give certain underserved communities greater access to the law field and law school itself. Certainly worthy goals there. And at that time, I think this was 2017 when this came up, LSAC got mad about it they actually said, if you're going to go ahead and use this test, we're going to decertify our results for you, which would be a big problem in terms of the ABA. And it wasn't just that Arizona kicked back against that. Every law school dean in America signed a letter to LSAC that said, you're not going to do that. And it's unfair for you to think you're going to do that. And you're trying to stifle innovation. And we're allowed to experiment because this is law school. This is not LSAC's law school. And so the second school to accept the GRE was actually Harvard. They came out of that.
Were they the second?
They were the second.
They were right up there in the top few. Wake Forest was early adopter too.
Yeah. But Harvard was the name that everybody was like, what?
Yeah, that was when you really heard the gong. Hang on.
Yeah. And of course, when the dean sent that letter to LSAC, they backed down. LSAC said, all right, fine, go ahead. There were concerns. There'd been a validity study done by ETS with Arizona. And John, I've read that validity study and I've commented elsewhere. It was backward looking, and they did some things in there where they paid current 1L law students to go take the GRE, and then they said, this shows how well they can do. Of course, that's not really the same thing. And we've talked about that on the podcast before. It wasn't a study that, for me personally, that I found at all convincing.
No,
in fact,
it was
I thought
deeply unsatisfying is what that was.
It was markedly flawed. If you know anything about doing studies like that, it needed to be a long-term longitudinal study. They didn't do that. They tried to cast it backwards. And so what the ABA ultimately said was, all right, you can use the GRE for admissions, but you have to do validity studies and prove that it works. And so for a lot of schools, they didn't want to do that. And over time, they added more and more schools, Georgetown being one of the biggest consumers of GRE applicants. And eventually, they got up to about 70 schools using the GRE, but they were still kind of constrained by what's known as section or standard 503 in the ABA code. And the ABA code essentially says you have to use a standardized admission test. It used to say you have to use the LSAT, and then they opened it up to a standardized admission test. And then they kind of were in a position where, from a law school standpoint, the LSAT had preference and it had ascendance. So this is kind of like the history of getting to where we're about to get to in a moment. And that meant that if you were an applicant, and this has been the case up until basically now, if you were an applicant who applied with a GRE only at a GRE accepting school, okay, you were fine. If you applied with both a GRE and LSAT, your GRE score got ignored. They used the LSAT that had preference. And then from a practical standpoint, law school admissions people didn't know the GRE, but they did know the LSAT, so they tended to really strongly prefer the LSAT. So that takes us really to today. And the question is, what happened?
Right.
So in November, the ABA had a meeting and addressed a bunch of things. And then they got kind of behind closed doors and started talking about 503, the one about standardized tests. And this has been going on for a while. You can look this up online. And essentially what they said was, you know what, we're going to let people use the GRE kind of in lieu of the LSAT. Meaning, if you had somebody who applied with both, it would be okay for them to use the GRE. And it was a weird ruling because they'd actually done a study of the validity, and the study concluded that it was an insufficient basis to know. But if you made some kind of like common sense assumptions, it was probably the case that the LSAT and the GRE were interchangeable, and any law school could use it. So if that's the case, we think it's defensible. And so once the ABA produced that report, in one section of it, they then put this under consideration and said, let's give it a shot. And now they are allowing the GRE to be used by itself and also in lieu of the LSAT. And any school can do that. They don't have to do validity studies. They don't have to jump through any hoops. They just have to say they want to accept it.
Yeah, I think the quote was something like, if certain plausible assumptions are made, then you can use one or the other. Which is, pretty mealy-mouthed, but it speaks to the point that now schools have a choice.
Yeah, so the GRE, which thought that it was about to take off, 4 years ago, but never really got traction, now they're saying, hey, it's okay. You can use them on an equal basis. You don't have to prove to us it's valid and worthwhile. And so even though some schools have been doing this, about 70 or so, the LSAT always had preference.
Right.
It always had dominion, especially when both scores were present. And so that really is a huge change. So when we take a look at what happens here, all the barriers to using the GRE have now been removed. No validity study. You don't have to worry about giving preference to the LSAT if both scores are there, and so forth. And I think what that means is in the long term, we're going to see the GRE begin to be used at most, if not all, schools.
I think we saw this coming, or at least I certainly suspected that this was the future. It got a very quick trajectory early, seemed to taper off a bit, and now I think has found its foothold again. The same thing happened with business school, where the GMAT reigned supreme, and the GRE, as a kind of dark horse, came in and really began to almost outcompete the GMAT.
They put them on their heels for a while.
For sure.
And now it's pretty much 50-50. Schools will take either. They don't have a specific preference. Took a little bit of time for that to happen. But I think that's the direction that we're actually heading in. So let's break it down short term and long term. What do you think happens in the short term here, this cycle, this instant?
Well, I don't think anything changes much immediately. So if anyone's listening to this, like scrambling to go take the GRE next week, that's a bit, I think, premature. I respect your enthusiasm, but it's probably too quick. So to me, I think the LSAT is still sort of the devil that's known. It's going to be the thing that dominates, at least for the next 12 months, I think, or 9 months maybe.
And if you're a school and you've printed your applications, it's all online, you're not going to all of a sudden add the GRE in December.
Right.
I mean, maybe some schools will, but that means I feel desperation in doing that. However, next year, what's the bar that stops you from taking the GRE? There is none. And almost all your compatriots are going to be doing it too. So you don't want to lose applicants to another school just because you don't take the GRE. Why not take it? Yeah. There's no material reason that I can see that a school won't take the GRE next year unless the admissions personnel literally put their foot down and say, we don't trust it.
Yeah.
And there may be a few schools. I don't think they're going to be the schools ranked, 150th. I could see it maybe a T14 or 2 saying, nope, we like the LSAT and we trust it. Why open the door? Why open Pandora's box on this? But they'll be the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, I think exception's definitely what it's going to be. I mean, look, I can think of at least 2 reasons that schools would want this, frankly. One is it allows you to court more applicants, which is always a good thing. They want numbers. And 2, it allows you to accept people who might not qualify otherwise. Why not have a different metric by which you can say yes to someone?
That's exactly right. And it also puts students in an advantageous position because now there's a second chance if the LSAT's not working for you. And it's not like the GRE is perfect. It's not at all my favorite test. And one of the things that a lot of people don't like about it is that it has math on it.
Yeah.
And so it's not as if you can escape this kind of like logic that is really symbolic in the sense that you see in logic games. You trading out logic games, which a lot of people don't like, and you're getting math instead. And a lot of people don't like that either. It's not like all flowers and puppies, floating through the clouds when it comes to the GRE. It's got its problems for, many people.
For some people, yeah, it just speaks to different skill sets. But in much the same way that this kills all my relationships, I like options. And this is a good thing. Having choice is a good thing. So people can get out there and play around and experiment and see what their actual skill sets are best defined by or best exemplified by.
And that really opens up the door because one of the things we've seen over the last year is students who come in who are like, well, I know I can take either test. I'm going to take the LSAT first, and I took it in June. Once they did that, they're done with the GRE. We would just tell them you can stop any GRE prep because it's going to get ignored in this process.
Yeah, let me actually double down on that statement because I don't think a lot of people understand this. The rule to this recording literally was that if you had an LSAT score on record, you were an LSAT score. Your GRE literally didn't matter. This changes that.
Yeah, they just ignored it. So if somebody took the LSAT first and said, now I'm going to go take the GRE and see if I do better, I'm like, you're wasting your time.
It's pointless. Until
there's a lot more to it than that. Even high GRE scores weren't exactly coveted because it is not a test that is as difficult as the LSAT. But now they don't have that same restriction. If somebody went and took the LSAT, and let's say they didn't do as well as they'd hoped, they didn't like their percentile, or it just was really below the medians for the schools they were looking at. If the school takes the GRE, now they can go take the GRE and they're not closed off.
Mhm.
They haven't, it is not clear yet because this is very new news and it is something that is really being debated. It's not clear how it'll be treated when you have 2 scores on record. But my theory, and I feel pretty strong about this, is that just like where you can take the highest LSAT score, the school will be allowed to take the highest test score. So if your GRE score is relatively higher than your LSAT, they won't have to worry about your LSAT. They'll just use your GRE score. I'm pretty sure that's actually the way it's going to work
I wouldn't
out.
bet against you, largely because it's in the school's favor for that to be the outcome.
It's also the theory your best performance.
Mhm.
Whatever your highest achievement is your highest. I mean, when we look at like Usain Bolt and how fast he is, we know what his fastest time is, and that's what we measure him by. We're like, that guy is that fast. We don't look at his worst race and say, that's who he is. No, he was that fast at one point in time, so he is that fast. It's the same thing with test scores. If you can go out and get a 170 on the LSAT and your next score is 165, you're a 170 to me. And you are to the law schools as well. So think about it from that standpoint. It's about hitting the high watermark.
Yeah.
That's how these schools are going to treat these scores as well, whether it's GRE or LSAT, and whether it's a single of each or multiple of each.
Yeah, watermarks as defined, I think, as they try to cross-compare by percentile. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know another way to equate this.
No, that's the best way to do it. And the GRE put out kind of a conversion
Mhm.
thing because there's multiple GRE scores, whereas there's only a single LSAT score. And that got a lot of play a few years ago. I don't know how accurate it was. I'm not.
It seemed to give the GRE quite a lot of credit, if memory serves.
Yes. If we had to make a bet on that or a guess, we'd say that they certainly had shaded it in their
It
favor.
seemed a little shaded. Maybe shady. But I think it's also because you and I have this deep respect of the LSAT that the GRE hasn't quite earned, maybe, up to this point. I'm not, again, trying to discredit what the test is. I do think it actually is a little bit probably more consumable for the average person.
Yeah, I've always felt that the LSAT's a better test.
Diplomatic
I'll
way to
just be
put
blunt
it.
about
A
it.
harder test, I think.
A more challenging test. Mechanically, I believe it's made at a higher level.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm happy to say that. I've said it many, many times. That holds for the GMAT too. I think the GMAT, personally for me, is a better made test, or at least a more challenging test than the GRE is.
I agree with you.
So it's, and again, if you're not familiar with these tests, they have different sections, different time lengths, but there are, the LSAT has logic games. You get to the GMAT, man, sentence correction is rough. That is a brutalizing section.
I did not think that'd be the one you'd pick.
I mean,
Well,
I
you
like
might do, like-
English and I like writing. Obviously, I've written a bunch of books, but sometimes when I look at sentence correction problems, I'm like, is there a right answer here? This is really fine line.
No comment.
It's not the critical reasoning, I'll tell you that.
No, I know you're good at that. That's just LSAT light.
Yeah, that is light LSAT. The RC kind of stuff doesn't bother me.
I would have thought
Yeah,
the
sentence
integrated
correction-
reasoning with the moving parts would have been a little more.
That doesn't bother me either. I'm pretty good with that kind of spreadsheety stuff. It's mainly because I zoned out in 8th grade, and so everything about like sentence structure and
Basic grammar.
parts.
Befuddles.
Yeah, I'm great contextually, but when you really get down to it, I'm like, wait, am I right about that? So now you know my deep.
Yeah,
dark
Dave's
secret weakness.
kryptonite. 8th grade grammar.
Don't run up to me with a sentence correction
That's right.
problem. I'll have to be like, wait, did I see somebody over there? Bye.
Funny. Yeah, your emails look like a Quentin Tarantino script. It's gibberish.
No, that's not the case. But either way, when we look at this GRE situation, probably what will happen here is going forward, you're going to start to see a movement towards equality. Is that going to happen next year? I don't think so. The LSAT will still be preferred, but what will happen is a lot of schools will now get the opportunity to see GRE score applicants. They'll become more familiar with them, and that process is going to continue incrementally for the next several years. We come back in 5 years, John, and do another podcast on this topic. I bet what we'll be seeing is, hey, they are used pretty much interchangeably, and that is not unreasonable.
Yeah, I think that's the way the winds are blowing. One of the things that it probably is taken off the table here which a couple of years back was actually in the mix of discussion, is I think this probably puts a little less urgency on schools to create their own admissions tests, which was something we had talked about.
You and I have talked about doing that because we think it could be done better, quite honestly. Certainly from, certain administrative aspects and also content and what is actually being tested. I don't think there is as much pressure when you can open the door to other exams.
Yeah, when there's more external options, you don't need to create your own internal one.
Yeah, it's going to create a war between LSAC and ETS, a marketing war, essentially, where you're going to have the LSAT calling itself the gold standard, the test that was made for law schools, and the GRE talking about wider access, especially for like diversity students, STEM students, non-traditional students. Because now if you take the GRE to become a nurse, you could think to yourself, well, maybe I'll go to law school instead. And so there's a much greater variety as well as volume of GRE takers compared to LSAT takers.
Oh, yeah, it's like a factor of 10 or something.
Is it 10 or is it more like 6?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a lot.
4?
Don't quote me on 10, but it's a lot. It might be 5 or 6, but I think
right after this podcast, we'll be
of course
the
looking it up. I'll get some angry messages.
Yeah, I feel like it's 4 to 5, but let's just say I'm right and move on from there.
I feel like at one point the GRE was over 1 million, but I could be wrong. It might be like 600.
I got to think about this because I might be getting it reversed with the GMAT. It doesn't matter. It's funny because you and I, when we first saw this GRE door open in 2017, we knew it was going to start happening. It didn't happen as quickly as we expected it to happen, and certainly I think as quickly as ETS saw it happening. But one of the things that we did last year was internally with PowerScore, we began working on a GRE course that is essentially like an on-demand course. I mean, you can go watch short videos, like 3 minutes on this topic, 4 minutes on this topic, and then it has related problem sets, and you can kind of focus on what you want. You really want to focus on math? Well, you can spend all your time in that part of the course. You want to focus more on the verbal stuff? It's there for you. You can go back and rewatch it. You can watch it whether it's midnight or whether it's 6 a.m. or whether it's 3 p.m. So kind of like choose your own adventure. And it's very much like our LSAT Bibles course. And everyone, I think, knows that the LR portion of that is already out there. It's built in that same model. That will be out probably in the middle of 2022.
Yeah, it's coming along. There's so many pieces, so many little modules to create, but it's going to speak exactly to this opportunity, frankly. And so, I'm happy to say that you and I both saw this coming enough that we actually got ahead of it.
Yeah, we did something right. Well, so that is actually in process and will be out. So about the time the GRE becomes a really big deal in law school admissions, or at least starts to enter the stage, that course will come on as well. So kind of like nice to see that hand in hand and to feel like we had some visionary moments a couple of years ago to see that it was going to occur.
Yeah, and you and I have both been involved in the creation of that course. I can say it's awesome. It's really cool.
More than me.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, the content of it, to me, is stellar. The problem sets, there's just hundreds of problems.
Really good.
Right now, we're working on the interface for plugging in your own answers for certain things because the GRE has a lot of different question formats, much different than the LSAT, much greater variety. So that is actually coming. Let's talk a little bit about, and just close it out with some of the uncertainties that you'll see with this over the next year. So when we look at this, we know what the ABA is done. That's a done deal. What happens here after we've talked a little bit about, some of the problems? One of the big ones is how U.S. News treats the GRE.
Yeah, which is obviously all about ranking.
Yeah, and it's weird. The ABA made a decision. You'd figure that's the end of the discussion, right? No, law schools care what U.S. News and World Report does because it affects their ranking. Right now, there's not a huge advantage to taking the GRE from a U.S. News standpoint. So what do we think they'll do in the future? I think they'll treat it equally to the LSAT. That's what they do on the MBA side. They treat the GMAT and the GRE as having equal weight. I think that is ultimately what we will see from U.S. News. It's uncertain, though. So we don't know that for sure. They haven't made a statement about it, but I suspect that is what they will ultimately do. And that will contribute further to the equality of these two tests going forward.
In most cases, there are still some schools out there that prefer the GMAT to the GRE for certain programs. It's a slightly more like math rigorous test, I think, by most opinion. So it's possible there's some schools that would be maybe try to single themselves out by being more LSAT exclusive or LSAT, preferred. We'll see how that goes. But I do think that they're going to reach roughly equivalent levels.
Yeah, isn't it like the University of Chicago Business School is really known as quant heavy?
I think that's a good example of it. Yeah.
So that's not the school I would go to for an MBA, personally.
They're my only choice.
Yeah, you're going to Chicago. I'm heading to Harvard. Even though I'm sure Harvard is no slouch when it comes to the quant aspect as well.
They're no slouch when it comes to anything. But yeah, there are probably going to be some schools that try to single themselves out based on certain preference. Some schools might become like GRE favored, heavier. We'll see.
Yeah, you can't really tell right now. You're going to have to see how it plays out, and we'll keep our eye on it. That's one uncertainty. Another uncertainty is that there is this built-in preference for the LSAT, and it's going to take time to overcome that. It's easy to think in 5 years that it's gone, but we don't know that it will be. It could, law school has been historically very stodgy in terms of change and slow to kind of adjust, and it may very well be the same situation. On the MBA side, there's a bunch of people who are looking at business, fast moving, fast changing. They want to grab opportunity and capitalize on it. That's not how the law has been.
No.
They're built on precedent. The LSAT is precedent here. So one of the uncertainties is, hey, maybe law schools will be slow to adjust because they're law schools. It doesn't matter what the ABA says. It doesn't matter what U.S. News thinks. That just may be built into their DNA.
Yeah, that's a good point. Schools are going to have to adapt, but I think it's going to be a little slower than some people might like.
Yeah, I think those two factors will ultimately, contribute to us deciding, how fast the GRE is accepted and the weight that it gets. But at least the course is open for the GRE at this point. LSAC, when asked about the use of the GRE, said, we object because we don't think it's a valid test. We don't think it's as predictive, and it wasn't made for law schools, and we think we do a better job, but we won't object in a meaningful way, meaning they're not going to stand in the way of it.
Yeah, they're going to fight back in the traditional business types of ways, which is we'd rather you give us your money. And so we'll market ourselves differently. But
yeah, and for those of you who are out there who are like, the GRE is going to crush the LSAT. The LSAT is dead. I hear you. I understand your, fervent dislike of the LSAT and in some cases LSAC, but I will point this out to you. Law school admissions is about a lot more than just the LSAT. And one of the things that LSAC does that is very useful for law schools is they provide a ton of back-end services, all sorts of data, all the collation through CAS of admissions material and letters of recommendation and standardization. That by itself is a huge part of their business. It entrenches them in this process. It centers them and makes them really something that's connected to every single law school and is very powerful. Data is at the heart of admissions these days, and understanding who your applicants are, where to find them, who you're choosing, who's going to matriculate is a huge part of the process. So it's not as if LSAC is like, well, there's not as many LSATs being given. They're not going to close up shop and leave. They're here to stay for the foreseeable next 2 decades.
Which I'm glad you bring this up, because I think maybe the point to close this out on, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who are thinking to themselves now, well, I have options. I can take the GRE, I can take the LSAT. How do I know what to do? What's the better choice for me? And so maybe we leave this on some sort of like actionable plan of sorts. And to me, if I were to give this advice to people, and I've been in the position where I've had to, I always say start with practice tests. See which of these 2 tests, because they're different enough, suit your skill sets, suit your natural abilities. I think that's where you begin. And then you begin to make informed decisions about what your potential is. And again, I think you have to base this around percentile. If you can reach the 90th percentile on the LSAT, not the GRE or vice versa, that defines your path forward.
I think it does. And you might want to take a close look at those percentiles too, because what you'll discover is it's very hard on the LSAT to get a high score. Once you get into the 170s, you're down to just a few percent of the population. Go take a look at the GRE percentiles. Very specifically, look at the math percentiles. A perfect score, the last time I checked, wasn't even 99th.
I think it's 95th, 93rd, something like that.
Used to be. I think it might be a little bit higher now. But this is one of the problems is you go out and get a perfect score on the quantitative section of the GRE. You're not in the top 1 percentile because so many people taking that test are engineers or math background people. And this is one of the weaknesses of the GRE. It has such a wide variety that ultimately you get a ton of really math-centric powerhouses taking that test, and they just go crush that section. And that test is scored on a 130 to 170 scale, by the way. So they go out and get a 170, and it's a perfect score. From a law school standpoint, that they hear 165 on the GRE, and it doesn't impress them because they're like, well, we know that's not really that high of a percentile. So don't get confused between the various scoring scales and the various percentiles. Look at the percentiles and say, what does that really mean? And then make the comparisons to the LSAT, because that's the best way to figure out what's going on. And that's the way the law schools will be doing it too.
Yeah, I think so too. It's an interesting point to make that the GRE literally cannot be hard enough to isolate people the way the LSAT does.
Yeah, I take that as a deficiency in the test.
I agree with you.
Who am I?
Well, since I agree with you, you're the man with the right answer. Congratulations.
It's always nice that way. So I think that's a pretty good wrap up of what's going on, the big decision of the ABA. Yeah. There was some play of it in the media. It came up, about a week after you left, and I was like, good, now I know what we're going to talk about when you get back.
Yeah, I came home.
This is not urgent, but it's super interesting. And if you do test like the way we do, obviously we're like,
yeah, it's certainly timely.
Yeah, it's very timely, and there's pluses and minuses to this. As I've said before, I don't love the GRE as a test because I don't find it inherently interesting. I think the LSAT is far more interesting as an exam, and in its current formulation will always remain that. But this is something that's very important for students to know about.
Yeah, and ultimately this is good news. I know a lot of students are like, oh God, now choices. Options are good. This is in everyone's, I think, benefit, including schools, frankly.
Yeah. If the LSAT doesn't go the way you want it to, and right now the LSAT still has preference, and it will have preference next year, so I would focus on the LSAT first. Go take the GRE and see how you do on some practice tests. Go study for it. Maybe you're just way better at the GRE than you are at the LSAT, and might be vice versa. If there's somebody out there who's listening who's like, look, I didn't do well on the GRE, maybe you'll go take the LSAT and do much better. That is equally possible here. So it gives you more choices, and I think you and I would both agree that there's nothing wrong with that.
Completely. All right. That's all I've got.
All right. Well, welcome back
to
the United States.
It's good to be back.
I think our next podcast
Skin on my
episode
teeth.
will...
Hate it.
The next episode will be kind of a recap of the last year. We like to do a State of the LSAT Union every year, so I think that's probably coming up in the next week or two. Got some interesting things to talk about since it's been a fascinating year. But on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. If you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We always do regular mailbags, and I'm sure one is coming up soon. On that note, and on behalf of John and myself, thanks for listening. Have a great week. Stay safe out there.